Hello and welcome. My name is Kieran Beer. I am the Chief Analyst and the Director of Editorial Content for ACAMS. I'm excited today to have Anna Bradshaw with me. Anna is a partner at Peters & Peters. I wondered if you could sort of lay out a little bit the enforcement landscape that financial institutions are looking at this moment.
The enforcement landscape that financial institutions in Europe are facing at this moment is a changing one. It's been the case for, it's fair to say, at least the last decade that the greatest enforcement threat by far for money laundering breaches, money laundering compliance breaches, as well as sanctions violations comes from the US as opposed to from the European regulators. And that's been picked up by numerous commentators, but increasingly picked up by the NGOs. And I think that's part of the problem. And also now in the last couple of years with the laundromat and associated large-scale scandals, finally, we are seeing attention being paid in the EU institutions and on the part of the national supervisory authorities. And it's very clear that enforcement action must be much more visible, much more meaningful in Europe than it has been to date. And that unfortunately means heads will have to roll. And that's where I predict things.
Well, so I've already started mentally to make the switch a little bit that while the U.S. led in the enforcement action things, that there really is, Europe is kind of coming online. It looks, at least that's sort of what they're promising to do, that there's been sort of a shock of the whole open capital markets and the flow of capital, and with it the flow of illicit funds, that, you know, the Baltic to Nordics road and everything. And so is that starting to be addressed in the 5th AMLD and in what people are talking about and going beyond?
Yes, the nature of the financial system in today's day and age is that it's so interconnected that, of course, anything that happens in Europe will be felt, not just in Europe, but also in places like the US and elsewhere. So it is, unfortunately, becoming much more in other countries' interests to make sure that Europe has its defences in order. And naturally, the EU does not want to be regulated externally and wants to take the lead, as it has done since the early 90s, when the first EU money laundering directive came into force. It wants to continue to be a thought leader, and it has the ideal conditions to develop much more enhanced cooperation mechanisms than the FATF has, for example, where the membership is too numerous, too diverse, whereas in the EU you have a close-knit network of like-minded countries who are neighbouring countries and much more likely to be involved in each other's cross-border financial flows. So for all those reasons, this is where we're seeing innovation in preventative anti-money laundering, but now also, hopefully, and predictably, in money laundering enforcement action.
So what's the Brexit threat to that? This seems to, where are we going to see a breakdown in some of that common pursuit of financial crime?
Well, the threat to the EU is perhaps not as great as the threat to the UK, unfortunately. The threat to the EU is the loss of the UK as a real driver for enhanced cooperation and innovative thinking in this particular area. The UK was a big proponent of
I suppose a sophisticated financial market and greater sophisticated anti-financial crime than some of Europe had.
Exactly. So it's a loss to the EU from that perspective, and also the amount of intelligence that comes out of the UK is very significant indeed. But from the UK's perspective, once it ceases to be an EU member state, it will no longer have direct access to the EU databases that are incredibly important to support law enforcement investigations and enforcement actions in financial crime. And it will also lose out on the various attempts of late to make also criminal justice cooperation in a more traditional sense more effective than it has to date. And this is where the so-called Sixth Money Laundering Directive comes in, although it's not technically part of the EU preventative regime. It's traditional law enforcement. The trend there now is to harmonise how member states define money laundering, the kind of penalties that are available for money laundering offences, with a view to removing the obstacles that historically might have impeded money laundering investigations and cooperation in prosecuting money laundering. That's not to say that it can't continue outside of the EU framework. But the clear risk is that the UK will be perceived as less of a first port of call also in that field. And then that in turn feeds into the possible perception that the UK will become a more attractive environment for financial crime as a result.
And hard Brexit, does that mean we're going to, the connections to Europol are in danger, and just practically in addition, and about registries, public registries for company registration, beneficial ownership registries and stuff?
Yes, I mean the public registries is, or I should say beneficial ownership.
We don't know. I guess how public they are depends on the country,
yes.
Right? But anyway, yes.
Indeed, the beneficial ownership registers have been really a UK-led innovation, and they are very, very keen to emphasise that they were first, really, when it came to opening up Companies House and requiring companies to identify who their beneficial owner or person with significant control was. And I suppose the more recent problems, if I can call it that, that have surfaced in connection with that particular register is the task or the challenge of keeping that information up to date and also accurate. And we're seeing a lot of attention being paid to how breaches of those obligations are going to be enforced in a way that makes the register reliable. And that's a problem that if the UK finds a good solution to, will no doubt be then replicated in other EU member states and indeed outside of the EU where other countries have gone down the same route. Of course, you have the beneficial ownership register for companies. You also have a separate register for trusts, which, as we discussed earlier, before we started filming, is not at the moment open to the public in the UK and
Those
might
trusts are kind of sacred in the UK by the history and everything else, right?
Well, exactly, and the main objection to making that register open to the public is the potential repercussions for privacy and even personal protection if that kind of information is publicly known. The third innovation, which the UK is also responsible for in this area, is this idea that is currently being developed as we speak of having a separate register of foreign ownership of UK property, foreign beneficial ownership of UK property, registered in very similar ways. And that is much more likely to contribute in a real tangible sense to at least UK specific initiatives to fight financial crime, particularly because it is expected to increase the use of civil recovery powers at the moment, so non-conviction based asset recovery. And that's again another area where the UK has really been a market leader, and the UK's experience has no doubt contributed to the willingness of the EU to pick up on the same...
The increasing use of these asset recovery orders orders, the unexplained wealth orders. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, so we're talking about civil recovery orders, which have been available in the UK for a long, long time. They featured as part of the original Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, but the unexplained wealth orders are much more recent. Is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about the civil? The unexplained wealth order is designed to make civil recovery orders easier to obtain. So it's an investigative tool to force people to give the information or not, that then makes civil recovery possible. So you, instead of going after a person, an individual or an entity, you go for the property, and you don't have to prove that an offence has been committed to a criminal standard. It's enough to demonstrate on the civil standard, which is the balance of probabilities, that the property, more likely than not, derives from or represents a person's benefit from criminal conduct.
So I just want to kind of conclude a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the separation of the UK Brexit and also cooperation via Brexit, and also cooperation with Europe and any kind of international reconciliation or let's see, commonality in anti-financial crime efforts. It kind of leads to a question about sanctions. I mean, the UK has started to go it alone with sanctions with OFSI, and there's still the U.S. sanctions out there and everything. How is that going to sort out Brexit, non-Brexit, and even now, how is the U.S. still sort of the leader in this sanctions regime stuff, and why?
The US is unquestionably the leader in the sanctions regime stuff.
Sometimes onerously so, but yes.
For two reasons. Partly because they've been doing it for longer and have much more developed ways of disseminating guidance. They're much more prepared to publish guidance. They're more prepared to engage with the private sector on sanctions-related issues. And by the US, of course, I mean principally the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. In the UK, by comparison, obviously is a new body. It's still 2, if not 3 years old now, coming up to. And it's been tasked with not just taking enforcement action, but also educating the UK market and the UK compliance community on what sanctions are, what they should be doing to comply with them. And there's a sense on the part of some UK policymakers that their hands have been tied in that respect, because if you're talking about EU sanctions, that guidance should be coming from the EU institutions, and the UK's interpretation of the EU sanctions would need to be cautiously formulated to ensure that it aligns. So now recently we've seen, in preparation for a no-deal Brexit, a huge amount of work being conducted by the UK authorities, not just the Treasury, of which obviously is a part, but also by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, on producing the detailed rules that would apply to replicate essentially the existing EU sanctions, but also at the same time provide more guidance on how those sanctions should be interpreted.
And that's been an issue right now. The guidance is still greater coming from the US. There's some new twists in the US sanctions, but there's still greater guidance, and you're hopeful that OFSI will kind of find their pace, and that the sanctions beyond the US, there'll be more guidance and more direction for.
Yes, very hopeful. Provided that OFSI keeps an eye on what's coming out of the US, because in sanctions, perhaps more than any other area of financial crime, you have to comply with multiple regimes at the same time, and the most frequently encountered duplicity is that's the wrong word, but you know what I mean, is the US and the EU sanctions regimes. And to ensure that you meet both expectations, ideally the guidance should be consistent, if not similar or identical, but then of course ideally the sanctions should be similar, if not
They're
identical.
diverging a little bit on Iran and other places, but
Exactly.
that may be the time for our next webinar that we talk about those things. So I'm going to thank you, Anna Bradshaw, Peters and Peters. A pleasure.
Thank
Thank you
for
so
having
much
me.
for being here.